The Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule, known as the FSMA PSR, focuses on the prevention of human pathogen contamination on produce that is typically consumed raw. In this video, we will reference sections of the FSMA PSR by number. You will see a symbol for section number, followed by the exact section number, and then wording from that section pertaining to the images we are showing. For example, the FSMA PSR states you must handle harvested covered produce in a manner that protects against contamination with known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. This section of the rule pertains to the importance for growers to assess their post-harvest handling practices and spaces for the potential of contamination. You may find equipment that is older, that may have been fixed over time, and equipment that you would like to replace soon. No matter what type of equipment on your farm, there will likely be food safety issues that can be addressed and improved. From an old wooden tomato grading line to a brand new stainless steel wash, grade, and pack line, equipment is typically not made with food safety in mind. This video will highlight key points of the FSMA PSR language specific to packing. We will discuss varying ways to achieve compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act, Produce Safety Rule, FSMA PSR. The FSMA PSR focuses on equipment and tools in the post-harvest handling section of the rule. This includes all surfaces that come in direct contact with produce. During an inspection, the quality of the materials will be considered, and the general condition of the post-harvest space. The rule states you must use equipment and tools that are of adequate design, construction, and workmanship to enable them to be adequately cleaned and properly maintained. Open foam padding such as pool noodles are not acceptable since they can harbor pathogens. This indoor-outdoor carpeting is difficult to clean and likely impossible to sanitize. A smooth, cleanable surface would be an ideal replacement. Equipment and spaces in the vicinity of where produce is being handled and packed can have an impact on safety as well. The rule states equipment and tools must be installed and maintained as to facilitate cleaning of the equipment and of all adjacent spaces. Dust, debris, trash, and pieces of damaged equipment can find their way onto food contact surfaces or the produce itself, causing a human health hazard. Regular cleaning and maintenance should take place to minimize these potential risks. The inspector will also take a closer look at equipment and surfaces that come in contact with produce. Bins, boxes, belts, joints, exposed hardware, brushes, rollers, temporary or permanent fixes, and any other piece of equipment will be assessed to determine if they are of adequate design. During this inspection, the farmer should be prepared to explain what the inspector is looking at. There are many different styles of post-harvest equipment in use today, and it is better to provide information than let the inspector make an assumption about what they are looking at. The rule states seams on food contact surfaces of equipment and tools that you use must either be smoothly bonded or maintained to minimize accumulation of dirt, filth, food particles, and organic material, and thus minimize the opportunity for harborage or growth of microorganisms. Packing house equipment is identified by their proximity to produce by zones. Zone 1 is any surface that directly touches produce, such as belts, brushes, rollers, the sorting table base and sides, and workers' hands and produce packaging. Zone 1 surfaces should be cleaned and sanitized more frequently than other surfaces. The rule requires all food contact surfaces of equipment and tools used in covered activities be inspected, maintained, and cleaned, and when necessary and appropriate, sanitized to protect against contamination of covered produce. The rule does not dictate how frequently the surfaces must be cleaned and sanitized, but the frequency should reflect how often the equipment is used, the condition of the produce coming in contact with the equipment, and the surrounding area's impacts on the equipment. Farmers should be prepared to discuss their decision-making strategies about the frequency of cleaning and sanitizing during an inspection. The FSMA PSR draft guidance discusses the use of foam on produce washing lines. It states that foam pads should be replaced as frequently as reasonably necessary to prevent contamination, or using an alternative product that allows for cleaning and sanitation and dries quickly. Zone 2 is any area adjacent to Zone 1, and produce in most cases does not come in contact with these surfaces. Zone 2 is important to consider because its cleanliness can impact the safety of Zone 1 surfaces. Zone 2 surfaces could include internal areas on the packing line, brush and roller housing, and wash water nozzles. The rule requires that growers also maintain and clean non-food contact surfaces, tools, and equipment when necessary to prevent contamination of produce. Zone 3 includes areas inside the packing house, such as floors, trash cans, and storage areas. Pathogens can multiply in standing water and be tracked throughout the packing house, finding their way onto Zones 1 and 2. Zone 4 is the area outside the packing house where you have to think about the flow of produce, people, and equipment in order to reduce risk. Standing back to watch the post-harvest handling process during your busiest time is a great way to identify where there are potential cross-contamination risks and develop a reasonable plan to manage them. Food contact surfaces should not be used to store non-produce items. These coveralls are soiled and could serve as a contamination source for washed produce that later comes in contact with the sorting table. Employees should recognize the potential for cross-contamination of Zone 1 surfaces from personal and other items. This type of risk reduction behavior falls in line with the rule that equipment and tools must be stored and maintained to protect covered produce from being contaminated with known or reasonably foreseeable hazards, and to prevent the equipment and tools from attracting and harboring pests. Preventing the introduction of human pathogens into a post-harvest area is a good way to reduce risk in that environment. While we don't expect farms to be able to exclude all vehicles and staff from the packing area, farms should ensure that only necessary activities are taking place in the post-harvest space. In this scenario, you see a truck backing into the packing house to offload produce. The truck could bring any number of contaminants into the space, and its access should be as limited as possible. The area that the truck has access should be cleaned and sanitized on a regular basis. Most harvest containers have holes on the sides and bottoms of them for airflow. These holes also allow the produce to come in contact with the surfaces that the containers are placed on. In many cases, these surfaces are not treated as direct food contact surfaces such as floors and wagon beds. Produce containers with holes on them should not be placed directly on the floor. In this case, they should be placed on the pallets placed on the floor for this specific purpose. The pallets should be handled in a way that they are kept sanitary for this type of use. Pallets should be stored and handled in a manner so that they do not become a source of contamination. Produce that comes in contact with the ground or other non-food contact surfaces such as a truck bed during post-harvest handling should not be allowed to enter market channels and should be cold. The rule states you must handle harvested covered produce during covered activities in a manner that protects against contamination with known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. Employees must be aware of when they might serve as a source of contamination. Signs of illness should be reported to their supervisor, and the employee's condition should be taken seriously. This also applies to injuries. Minor injuries should be bandaged, and in the case of a hand injury, the bandage should be covered with a single-use glove to prevent the bandage or fluids from contaminating produce. The rule does not require glove use by employees, but single-use gloves should be available for when one is needed to cover a hand injury. The rule states you must take measures to prevent contamination of covered produce and food contact surfaces with microorganisms of public health significance from any person with an applicable health condition, such as communicable illnesses that present a public health risk in the context of normal work duties, infection, open lesion, vomiting, or diarrhea. Maintenance of equipment is a common theme during the harvest season. The rule states you must use equipment and tools that are of adequate design, construction, and workmanship to enable them to be adequately cleaned and properly maintained, and stored and maintained to protect covered produce from being contaminated with known or reasonably foreseeable hazards, and to prevent the equipment and tools from attracting and harboring pests. When maintenance is needed on equipment, the work should be done when produce is not on the line, and an assessment should be made after the work is completed to determine if cleaning and sanitizing of the equipment is needed prior to use. Workers should use their cell phones and other personal items away from the packing line. Workers should wash their hands after using these items before they return to work. Management at the operation should set a good example by following these guidelines. The rule states maintaining adequate personal cleanliness to protect against contamination of covered produce and food contact surfaces. Employees should be encouraged to remove hand jewelry that cannot be cleaned. In the case of a worker who does not wish to remove the jewelry, they will need to cover the jewelry adequately with an appropriately used glove. The rule states removing or covering hand jewelry that cannot be adequately cleaned and sanitized during periods in which covered produce is manipulated by hand. Not eating, chewing gum, or using tobacco products in an area used for covered activity. However, drinking beverages is permitted in designated areas. And washing hands thoroughly, including scrubbing with soap and running water that satisfies the requirements of 112.44a for water used to wash hands, and drying hands thoroughly using single-service towels, sanitary towel service, electric hand dryers, or other adequate hand drying devices. Water must have no detectable generic E. coli. Equipment, tools, and food packing materials must be stored and maintained to protect covered produce from being contaminated with known or reasonably foreseeable hazards, and to prevent the equipment and tools from attracting and harboring pests. Farms growing and handling produce that is covered by the rule and produce that is not covered by the rule. In this example, summer squash is the covered produce, while eggplant is not covered. We'll need to consider how each is grown, harvested, packed, and held. If the field inputs are the same, irrigation water from the same source, harvest containers, and tools are treated the same, then the covered and non-covered produce items can be considered the same for packing. If there are differences in the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of these items that do not meet the requirements of the FSMA PSR, then any surfaces that the non-covered produce items touch will need to be cleaned and sanitized before covered produce items can touch them. The rule states if you grow, harvest, pack, or hold excluded produce as defined in Section 112.2, and the excluded produce is not grown, harvested, packed, or held in accordance with the PSR requirements, you must take measures during covered activities on covered produce to keep covered produce separate from the excluded produce. Adequately clean and sanitize as necessary any food contact surfaces that contact excluded produce before using food contact surfaces for covered activities on covered produce. Wastewater from hand washing should not be allowed to enter into production areas and into pathways of people and equipment. The rule states you must provide for appropriate disposal of waste associated with a hand washing facility and take appropriate measures to prevent wastewater from hand washing facility from contaminating covered produce, food contact surfaces, areas used for covered activity, agricultural water sources, and agricultural water distribution systems with known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. Wastewater must be captured in a containment system such as a plumbing system, a catchment basement, a 5-gallon bucket, or another means of preventing the wastewater from becoming a cross-contamination concern. The first step in the cleaning and sanitizing process is to remove any obvious dirt and debris from the food contact surface, such as a water spray and a scrub brush when necessary. The FSMA PSR requires that you must inspect, maintain, and clean, and when necessary and appropriate, sanitize all food contact surfaces of equipment and tools used in covered activities as frequently as reasonably necessary to protect against contamination of covered produce. Remember that food contact surfaces are those that come in direct contact with covered produce. It can be helpful to think about how produce flows into, through, and out of your packing area to identify these surfaces. The second step of the cleaning and sanitizing process is to apply an appropriate detergent and scrub the surface. An appropriate detergent would be one that works well with the surfaces on your post-harvest surfaces and fits in with your cleaning and sanitizing plan. The third step in the cleaning and sanitizing process is to rinse the surface with clean water, making sure to remove all of the detergent and soil. Some surfaces are more difficult to rinse than others. When this is the case, consideration should be made to replace the surface with one that is easier to clean. Water must have no detectable generic E. coli. The fourth step in the cleaning and sanitizing process is to apply a sanitizer approved for the use on food contact surfaces. Rinsing of the sanitizer may be necessary. The sanitizer instructions should indicate if a rinse is needed. The surfaces should then be allowed to air dry. The FSMA PSR requires that certain records be kept and will be assessed during an inspection. The Produce Safety Alliance has PDF and Word versions of record templates that farmers can use and are what we've shown here today. Each record should include the farm name and address and indicate the specifics of the activity that is being recorded. Records must be kept for a minimum of 2 years for FSMA PSR compliance.